All right, so now we're going to look at some specific groups and how the war affected them. And so the first group we're going to look at are Mexican Americans in the United States. For non-whites, the war and the message of the war was far more ambiguous than it was for white Americans. Probably the most significant effect on Mexican Americans was the Bracero program. The Bracero program was an agreement by the Mexican and American governments in 1942, which allowed tens of thousands of contract laborers to cross into the United States to take up jobs as domestic and agricultural workers. This was intended originally as a temporary response to wartime labor shortages, but the program lasted all the way until 1964. The Bracero program reinforced the idea that Mexican immigrants were unskilled labor primarily. Wartime employment, however, opened new opportunities for second-generation Mexican Americans who worked in defense industries or often served in the Army. Perhaps 1 million Mexican American men and women served in the Army, and contact with other groups led many to learn English and promoted inter-ethnic marriages. However, the integration was not always a peaceful one. In 1943, club-wielding sailors and police attacked Mexican-American youths in flamboyant clothes, or zoot suits, on the streets of Los Angeles in what was later termed the Zoot Suit Riots. So there were definite limits on wartime tolerance. Mexican Americans brought complaints of discrimination before the Fair Employment Practices Commission, and the war's rhetoric of freedom and pluralism and the reality of continued discrimination inspired a heightened consciousness of civil rights, which would take hold after the war and contribute as part of the wider civil rights movement in the 1960s. For Native Americans, many were brought closer to the mainstream of American life through the experience of the war. American Indians served in the Army, with some 25,000 of them serving in the Army. You have, of course, the famous code talkers, which were Navajo Indians, who transmitted messages in their complex native language as code, which the Japanese never were able to decipher. The Iroquois nation issued its own declaration of war against the Axis powers. They insisted that the United States lacked the authority to draft Native men into the war, and so they declared war themselves. Many Native Americans took advantage of the GI Bill to attend college, an opportunity that was rarely open to them previously. And tens of thousands left the reservations to take jobs in war industries. Many of these people were exposed for the first time to urban life and industrial society, and many of them chose not to return to reservations after the war. The reservations themselves, however, did not generally share in wartime prosperity.